A woman sold for scraps. A man who bought her just to set her free. A system that wanted her broken, but didn't know she was already learning to fight back. Welcome to the story of Hannah Mercer, the girl no one wanted and the storm no one saw coming. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The cold came first. It always did in Black Ridge. The kind of cold that didn't just bite, it invaded. Crept under your coat, wrapped around your ribs, and settled in your bones like it had paid rent. Hannah Mercer stood on the auction platform with her wrists bound in front of her, staring at a crowd that wouldn't look back. She wasn't surprised. She'd stopped expecting kindness a long time ago. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Gaffney, with a voice like gravel in a tin can, droned on beside her. 7 years' labor to settle the debt of Thomas Mercer. Deceased. Strong enough for basic work. No skills to speak of. Bids start at 20. 20 coins. That's what her father's failure had earned her. That's what her life was worth in this frozen corner of nowhere. Nobody moved. Hannah kept her eyes on the horizon, where the mountains cut jagged lines against the white sky. If she looked at the crowd, she'd see the smirks, the rolled eyes, the way people leaned toward each other and whispered. She already knew what they were saying. Too big, too plain, too much trouble. She'd heard it all before. 20, Gaffney repeated, irritation creeping into his voice. Come on now, she's healthy. Young enough. 7 years is a long contract. You'll get your money's worth. A man near the front, thick-necked and red-faced, let out a bark of laughter. For what? Hauling grain sacks? I got mules cheaper than that. The crowd chuckled. Hannah's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. She'd learned a long time ago that reacting only made it worse. Gaffney's face darkened. 15, then. Anyone? Silence. Hannah felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart. That had broken years ago. This was something deeper. The last fragile thread of hope she hadn't realized she'd been holding on to. No one wants you. No one ever will. 10, Gaffney said, and now he sounded desperate. Auctions didn't fail in Black Ridge. Debts had to be paid. If no one bought her contract, the law would step in, and that meant the workhouse. 3 meals of slop, a straw mat, and 18-hour days until her body gave out or the 7 years ran dry, whichever came first. Hannah had seen women come out of the workhouse, the ones who came out at all. She closed her eyes. 10 coins, Gaffney shouted. That's a goddamn steal, and you all know it. A woman in the crowd whispered loud enough to carry. Steal of what? Dead weight? More laughter. Hannah's breath came shallow now. She could feel the walls closing in, the future narrowing to a single dark point. The workhouse, the cold, the slow grinding erasure of everything she was. And then, I'll take her. The voice cut through the noise like a blade through snow. Deep, steady, unfamiliar. Hannah's eyes snapped open. The crowd shifted, parting like water, and a man stepped forward. Tall. Taller than anyone she'd seen in Black Ridge, with broad shoulders under a worn wool coat and a face that looked like it had been carved out of stone and left to weather in the wind. His hair was dark, streaked with gray at the temples, and his eyes were the color of winter rivers. Cold, but not cruel. He didn't look at her. He looked at Gaffney. How much? The man said. Gaffney blinked, caught off guard. 10 coins for the contract, but the debt's 87 total. If you want to buy her out clean, you pay it all up front. How much? The man repeated, slower this time, like he was talking to a child. 87? Gaffney stammered. But no one pays the full... The man reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He tossed it onto the platform. It landed with a heavy thud, coins clinking inside. The crowd went silent. Gaffney stared at this pouch like it might explode. Then he opened it, fingers trembling, and started counting. His lips moved soundlessly. When he finished, he looked up, pale. It's all here. The man nodded once. Then we're done. He turned toward Hannah for the first time. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she forgot how to breathe. There was no pity in his gaze, no hunger, no calculation, just a quiet, unreadable weight. He stepped onto the platform, and the crowd murmured. Gaffney moved aside, clutching the pouch like a lifeline. The man stopped in front of her. Up close, he was even bigger, broad-chested, scarred hands, the kind of man who looked like he'd spent his whole life breaking things and putting them back together. Hannah's heart hammered. She didn't know what he wanted, didn't know what came next. She only knew that men who paid that much expected something in return. He reached for her wrists. She flinched. He paused. Then slowly, he pulled a knife from his belt. Hannah's breath hitched. The crowd pressed closer, eager. And then he cut the ropes. The bindings fell away. Hannah's hands dropped to her sides, numb and trembling. She stared at him, confused, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The command, the collar, the leash. He sheathed the knife, stepped back, and said 5 words that didn't make any sense. "You don't owe me anything." Hannah blinked. "What?" "You heard me. Her voice cracked. "I don't understand." "You're free," he said simply. "Go wherever you want." The crowd erupted. Voices overlapped, sharp and disbelieving. "What the hell is this? He paid 87 coins just to let her go? Is he touched in the head?" Gaffney stepped forward, red-faced. "Now hold on. This isn't how it works. You bought the contract. She's yours." The man turned his head just slightly and looked at Gaffney. Didn't say a word, didn't have to. Gaffney took a step back. The man looked at Hannah again. "You coming or you staying?" Hannah's mind spun. This had to be a trick. A trap. Men didn't do this. They didn't pay a fortune just to let someone walk away. But his eyes didn't waver. And for the first time in years, she saw something that almost looked like respect. She swallowed hard. "I don't have anywhere to go." He nodded, like he'd expected that. "Then come with me." He turned and walked off the platform, boots crunching in the snow. Hannah stood frozen. The crowd stared at her, waiting to see what she'd do, waiting to see if she'd run or collapse or prove them all right. She looked down at her hands, free, unbound, and then she followed him. The man's name was Caleb Ridge. She didn't learn that until they were an hour outside Black Ridge, trudging up a narrow trail that cut through the mountains like a scar. He walked ahead, steady and unhurried, and she stumbled behind him, her thin coat doing nothing against the wind. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was practical. "Keep your hands in your pockets. Frostbite sets in fast. Step where I step. Ice underneath the snow. There's a cabin another mile up. We'll stop there." Hannah wanted to ask 100 questions. Why did you buy me? What do you want? What happens when we get to the cabin? But her throat was too tight, and the cold made it hard to think, so she just kept walking. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was sinking behind the peaks, and her legs felt like they were made of lead. The structure was small, rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, shuttered windows, but it looked solid, sturdy. Caleb pushed the door open and stepped inside. Hannah hesitated on the threshold. "Come on," he said, without looking back. "You'll freeze out there." She stepped inside. The cabin was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the air smelled like pine and smoke. There was a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and shelves lined with jars and tools. Simple, lived in. Caleb shrugged off his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the table. "I'll make something to eat." Hannah sat. Her hand shook as she pulled off her gloves. She watched him move around the cabin, stoking the fire, pulling out bread and dried meat, filling a kettle with water. He moved like a man who'd done this 1,000 times. Efficient, unbothered. Finally, she couldn't hold it in anymore. "Why?" He glanced at her. "Why what?" "Why did you do it?" Her voice was raw. "Why did you pay all that money just to let me go?" Caleb set the kettle over the fire and leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. He studied her for a long moment. "You ever see someone drowning?" he asked. Hannah frowned. "What?" "Drowning," he repeated. "In a river, a lake, doesn't matter. You ever see it?" She shook her head slowly. "Most people think drowning looks like thrashing, screaming, arms flailing." He paused. "It doesn't. Drowning looks quiet. Looks like someone just standing there, water up to their chin, too tired to fight anymore." He met her eyes. "That's what you looked like up on that platform." Hannah's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't buy you, Caleb said. I bought your debt, and then I ended it, that's all. That's all? She let out a shaky laugh. You paid 87 coins, that's not nothing. Money comes and goes. He turned back to the fire. Freedom doesn't. Hannah stared at him, at the broad line of his shoulders, the scars on his hands, the way he moved like a man who'd carried weight his whole life and never complained about it. Who are you? She whispered. Nobody important. That's not an answer. He pulled the kettle off the fire and poured water into 2 tin cups. Then he set one in front of her and sat down across the table. I'm someone who's seen what happens when people get ground down by a system that doesn't give a damn about them, he said quietly. And I'm someone who decided a long time ago that if I could stop it, even once, I would. He took a sip of his water. That answer enough for you? Hannah wrapped her hands around the warm cup. Her mind was still spinning, but something in her chest loosened, just a little. What happens now? She asked. Caleb shrugged. That's up to you. I don't understand. You're free, he said. You can stay here tonight, rest up, and leave in the morning. I'll give you enough supplies to get to the next town, or... He paused. You can stay longer, work if you want, learn a few things. No contract, no debt, just work. Hannah's throat burned. Why would you let me stay? Because I could use the help, he said simply, and because you look like you could use a place to figure things out. She stared into her cup. Steam curled up from the surface, vanishing into the cold air. I don't know how to do anything, she admitted. I'm not useful. Everyone's useful, Caleb said. You just haven't had the chance to prove it yet. Hannah looked up at him. His face was unreadable, but there was something steady in his eyes, something that didn't flinch. Okay, she whispered. Okay. I'll stay. Her voice was stronger now. For a little while, if that's really all right. Caleb nodded. It's all right. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind howled through the mountains, but inside, the warmth held. And for the first time in years, Hannah Mercer felt something she'd almost forgotten. Safe. The first week was hell, not because Caleb was cruel. He wasn't. Not because the work was impossible. It wasn't. But because Hannah's body, soft from years of neglect and hunger, wasn't built for the mountains. Every morning, Caleb woke her before dawn. The cabin was freezing, the fire burned down to embers, and her muscles screamed from the day before. But he'd hand her a cup of something hot, tea, broth, coffee, and say, "Come on, daylight's burning." And she'd follow him outside into the cold. The work was endless. Chopping wood, hauling water from the stream, feeding the horses, 2 sturdy mountain breeds that eyed her with suspicion, mending fences, clearing snow, checking traps. Hannah had never done any of it before. She was slow, clumsy. She dropped things, cut herself on the axe, slipped on the ice, and landed hard enough to bruise. Caleb never yelled, never mocked her. He just showed her how to do it again. Grip the axe lower, let the weight do the work. Don't yank the bucket, tilt it. Watch your footing. Ice doesn't care how careful you think you're being. By the end of the first week, Hannah's hands were blistered and raw. Her back ached. Her shoulders burned. She fell into bed every night too exhausted to even dream. But she didn't quit. The second week, something shifted. Her hands started to callous. Her muscles stopped screaming quite so loud. She learned to read the rhythm of the work. When to push, when to pace herself, when to stop and breathe before her body gave out. And she started to notice things. The way Caleb moved, efficient, deliberate, never wasting energy. The way he anticipated problems before they happened. The way he treated the horses, firm but kind, like they were partners instead of tools. One morning, she watched him split a log in 3 clean strikes, and something clicked in her head. She picked up the axe, adjusted her grip the way he'd shown her, and swung. The log split clean down the middle. Caleb glanced over, nodded. Good. That one word hit harder than she expected. The third week, she started talking. Not much, just little things. Questions about the work, observations about the weather, comments about the horses. Caleb answered when she asked, but he didn't push, didn't pry. It was like he understood that silence was easier for her, and he was willing to wait until she was ready. One night, after dinner, she asked, "Why do you live up here?" He looked at her across the table, firelight flickering over his scarred hands. Same reason you're here now. I needed space to figure things out. And did you? He smiled faintly. Still working on it. Hannah traced the edge of her cup with one finger. Were you running from something? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Yeah. What? Myself mostly. She frowned. What does that mean? He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. I used to work in the valleys, factories, mills, that kind of thing. Thought if I worked hard enough, kept my head down, I'd be fine. But the system doesn't care how hard you work, it just grinds you down, takes everything and gives you nothing. He paused. I saw people break, saw them give up. And I realized I was heading the same way. He looked at her. So I left, came up here, built this place. And I decided I'd rather live on my own terms, even if it's hard, than let someone else decide what my life is worth. Hannah's throat tightened. That's why you bought me. That's why I freed you, Caleb corrected. There's a difference. She nodded slowly. Thank you. You don't have to thank me. Yes, I do. He didn't argue. By the 4th week, Hannah was riding. Caleb had 2 horses, a gray mare named Smoke and a chestnut gelding named Rust. Smoke was calm, steady, patient. Rust was a bastard. Start with Smoke, Caleb said, leading the mare out of the small barn. She'll take care of you. Hannah eyed the horse nervously. I know. That's why we're doing this. He showed her how to mount, how to hold the reins, how to sit without tensing up. Smoke stood perfectly still, like she'd done this 100 times before. She's good with beginners, Caleb said. Just trust her. Hannah took a shaky breath and pulled herself into the saddle. The world looked different from up here. Bigger, wider. Caleb handed her the reins. Gentle pressure. She'll follow your lead. Hannah squeezed her legs lightly, and Smoke started walking. Slow. Steady, like she knew exactly what Hannah needed. For the first time in weeks, Hannah smiled. The 5th week, her uncle came. Hannah was outside chopping wood when she heard the horses, 2 of them coming up the trail fast. She turned, axe still in hand, and saw the riders crest the ridge. Her stomach dropped. She recognized the first man immediately. Warren Mercer, her father's brother. Thin, sharp-faced, with eyes like a weasel and a voice that could cut glass. The second man was a stranger, big, broad-shouldered, wearing a deputy's badge. Warren dismounted and strode toward her, fury written across his face. There you are. Hannah's grip tightened on the axe. What do you want? What do I want? Warren's voice rose. You ran off, girl. You think you can just disappear? I didn't run off. I was bought, and then I was freed. Freed? Warren let out a harsh laugh. There's no such thing. You're under contract. The contract was paid in full, Hannah said, her voice shaking but firm. I don't owe anything. Warren's eyes narrowed. You owe me. Your father's debts don't just vanish because some mountain man threw coins at them. You're family. You're my responsibility. I'm not your anything. The deputy stepped forward, hand on his belt. Miss Mercer, your uncle's filed a claim, says you're a runaway under false pretenses. We need you to come back to town and sort this out. Hannah's heart pounded. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have a choice, Warren snapped. The law's on my side. Is it? Caleb's voice cut through the air like a blade. Hannah turned. He was standing in the doorway of the cabin, arms crossed, face unreadable. Warren's sneer faltered. Who the hell are you? The man who paid her debt, Caleb said evenly. In full. Witnessed. Recorded. That doesn't matter, Warren spat. She's my kin. I have rights. You have nothing, Caleb said. She's not your property. She's not anyone's property. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Ridge, if there's a legal dispute— There's no dispute, Caleb said. I have the receipt, signed by Gaffney, stamped by the Blackridge office. The debt's settled. She's free. Warren's face twisted. You think you can just steal her away, hide her up here like some kind of— I didn't steal anyone, Caleb said, his voice dropping to something colder. She chose to stay. And if you've got a problem with that, take it up with the law. But get off my land. Warren took a step forward. You don't know who you're dealing with. Caleb didn't move. Neither do you. The silence stretched. The deputy glanced between them, clearly wanting no part of this. Finally, Warren spat into the snow. "This isn't over." He mounted his horse, yanked the reins hard, and rode off. The deputy followed, looking relieved. Hannah stood frozen, the axe still in her hands. Her whole body was shaking. Caleb walked over to her. "You all right?" She nodded, but her voice was thin. "He's not going to stop." "I know." "He'll find a way. He always does." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Then we'll deal with it when it comes." "We? You think I'm letting him drag you back?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Not a chance." Hannah's chest ached. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that someone would actually stand between her and the world. But she'd learned a long time ago that hope was dangerous. Still, she nodded. "Okay." Caleb put a hand on her shoulder, brief, steady, and then turned back toward the cabin. Hannah stood there a moment longer, staring at the empty trail. And for the first time in her life, she realized something. She wasn't afraid of her uncle. She was angry. That anger stayed with her. It didn't burn hot. It was colder than that. Sharper. It settled in her gut like a stone and refused to move. The next morning, Hannah woke before Caleb. She dressed in the dark, pulled on her boots, and went outside. The sky was still purple with dawn, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. She walked to the woodpile, picked up the axe, and started swinging. 1 log, 2, 3. Her hands ached, her shoulders burned, but she didn't stop. By the time Caleb came out, she'd split half the pile. He stood on the porch, holding a cup of coffee, and watched her for a moment. Then he walked over and held out the cup. "You trying to prove something?" he asked. Hannah took the coffee, her hands trembling. "Maybe." "To who?" She looked at him, then back at the logs. "To myself." Caleb nodded slowly. "All right, but pace yourself. We've got a long winter ahead." He turned to leave, then paused. "And Hannah?" She glanced up. "You don't have to earn your place here. You already have it." He walked back inside before she could answer. Hannah stood there, coffee warming her hands, staring at the split wood. She didn't know if she believed him. Didn't know if she'd ever believe anyone again. But she kept swinging anyway. Winter deepened. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, and the wind howled through the peaks like something alive and angry. Hannah learned to move through it, learned to read the weather, to know when a storm was coming by the weight of the air, to tell good ice from bad by the sound it made underfoot. Caleb taught her everything, not with lectures or lessons, but by doing. He'd show her once, maybe twice, and then step back and let her figure it out. When she failed, and she failed often, he didn't criticize. He just said, "Try again." She learned to set traps for rabbits and check them without leaving tracks. Learned to skin and gut without wasting meat. Learned to recognize edible plants buried under snow, to start a fire with damp wood, to ride smoke up trails so narrow her legs brushed the rock face. Rust, the chestnut bastard, still wouldn't let her near him. "He doesn't trust easy," Caleb said one morning, watching Rust toss his head and sidestep when Hannah approached. "Neither do I," Hannah muttered. Caleb smiled faintly. "Then you two have something in common." She spent weeks trying, bringing Rust apples, carrots, handfuls of oats, standing near his stall and talking to him, not about anything important, just whatever came to mind, the weather, the work, her thoughts. Rust ignored her. Until one morning, when she walked into the barn and found him standing at the gate, ears forward, watching her. She stopped, held out her hand. Rust snorted, tossed his head, and then stepped forward and lipped the apple from her palm. Hannah's chest swelled. She reached up slowly, touched his neck. He didn't pull away. "Yeah," she whispered. "Me too." The isolation didn't bother her the way she thought it would. In Black Ridge, she'd been surrounded by people and still felt invisible. Here, with just Caleb in the mountains, she felt seen. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that came from two people who didn't need to fill the air with noise to feel less alone. Some nights, after dinner, Caleb would pull out a battered book and read by the fire. Hannah would sit across from him, mending clothes or sharpening tools, and listen to the crackle of burning wood. Sometimes he'd read aloud, old adventure stories, histories of places she'd never heard of, Poems that didn't rhyme but somehow still made sense. Other nights she'd ask questions. "Where'd you learn all this?" she asked one evening, nodding toward the cabin, the tools, the careful order of everything. Caleb closed his book. "Trial and error mostly. My father taught me some. The rest I picked up along the way." "Your father lived up here?" "No, he worked the mines down in the valleys, died when I was 16. Hannah's hand stilled. "I'm sorry." Caleb shrugged. "It was a long time ago." Still, he looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "Your father, what happened to him?" Hannah's throat tightened. She hadn't talked about Thomas Mercer since the auction, hadn't wanted to. "He drank," she said finally. "Gambled, borrowed money from people he shouldn't have, and when he couldn't pay it back, She stopped, swallowed. "He hung himself in the barn." Caleb didn't say he was sorry, didn't offer empty comfort. He just nodded, like he understood that some things didn't have words. "My uncle found me standing there," Hannah continued, her voice flat. "Didn't even cut him down first. Just looked at me and said, 'Well, you're the debt now.'" Caleb's jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. "I hated him," Hannah said. "My father. For a long time I hated him more than anyone." She paused. "I still do, I think. But I don't know. I understand him a little better now." "How so?" "He didn't know how to fight back," she said. "Didn't know how to do anything except run. And when there was nowhere left to run," she trailed off. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're not him. How do you know?" "Because you're still here." Hannah looked at him. His face was serious, firelight carving shadows across his scars. "You didn't run," Caleb said. "You didn't give up. You're learning, fighting. That's the difference." Hannah wanted to believe him, but the voice in her head, the one that sounded like Warren, like her father, like every person who'd ever dismissed her, whispered that it didn't matter, that she'd fail eventually, that she always did. She went to bed that night with the voice still whispering. But the next morning, she got up and chopped wood anyway. 3 weeks later, Warren came back. This time, he brought a lawyer. Hannah was in the barn brushing down smoke when she heard the horses. Her stomach dropped. She stepped outside, and there they were. Warren, the same weasel-faced deputy, and a thin man in a black coat carrying a leather briefcase. Caleb was already on the porch, arms crossed. Warren dismounted and walked forward, smug satisfaction written all over his face. "Morning, Mr. Ridge." Caleb didn't answer. Warren gestured to the man in black. "This is Mr. Pritchard. He's a lawyer from the territorial office. We've come to settle this matter properly." Pritchard stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. "Mr. Ridge, I've reviewed the contract in question, and while the debt was paid, there are complications." "What complications?" Caleb's voice was flat. Pritchard pulled a document from his briefcase. "Miss Mercer is still listed as a dependent under her uncle's household. As her legal guardian, Mr. Warren Mercer has the right to determine her residence and employment until she reaches the age of 25 or marries." Hannah's blood turned to ice. "That's bullshit," Caleb said. "It's the law," Pritchard replied smoothly. "The debt may be settled, but familial obligations remain." Warren stepped forward, grinning. "So you see, Mr. Ridge, she's coming with me, whether you like it or not." Hannah's hands clenched into fists. She wanted to scream, to fight, to burn the whole system down, but her throat was locked tight. Caleb looked at Pritchard. "And if she refuses?" "Then she'll be charged with defying lawful guardianship," Pritchard said, "which carries a penalty of imprisonment or forced labor. So either way, she's trapped." Pritchard's expression didn't change. "The law's clear, Mr. Ridge." Hannah felt the walls closing in again. The same suffocating weight she'd felt on the auction platform. The world narrowing to a single dark point. And then Caleb spoke. "What if she marries?" Everyone went silent. Warren's grin faltered. "What?" Caleb looked at Hannah. "You said guardianship ends if she marries." Pritchard frowned. "Yes, but then she'll marry me." The world tilted. Hannah stared at him, her heart hammering. "What?" Caleb held her gaze. "It's a legal solution. You marry me, Warren loses guardianship, and you're free to stay or go as you choose. That's..." Hannah's voice cracked. "That's insane." It's practical. You don't even know me. I know enough. Warren stepped forward, face red. This is ridiculous. You can't just... Can I? Caleb looked at Pritchard. Is there a law against it? Pritchard hesitated. Well, no. If both parties consent and the marriage is legally recorded, then yes, guardianship would transfer. Then that's what we'll do. Hannah's mind spun. This couldn't be real. Men didn't offer marriage to solve problems. They offered chains, conditions, control. But Caleb wasn't looking at her like she was a problem. He was looking at her like she was a person who deserved a choice. Hannah, he said quietly, it's your decision. She looked at Warren, at the deputy, at Pritchard with his briefcase full of laws designed to keep people like her in cages. Then she looked at Caleb, steady, unshakable, the man who'd cut her ropes and asked for nothing. Okay, she whispered. Caleb nodded. Okay, Warren exploded. This is fraud, coercion. I'll take this to the magistrate. Do it, Caleb said. And while you're there, explain why you're so desperate to control a woman who wants nothing to do with you. Warren's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Pritchard cleared his throat. If this is her decision, Mr. Mercer, there's little we can do. The law permits it. Warren's face twisted with rage. You think you've won? You think this changes anything? Yeah, Caleb said. I do. Warren spat into the snow, climbed onto his horse, and rode off without another word. The deputy followed. Pritchard lingered for a moment, gave Caleb a long look, and then left as well. The silence that followed felt like the air after a lightning strike. Hannah stood frozen, her heart still racing. Did that just happen? Caleb let out a slow breath. Yeah. You just proposed to me to get rid of my uncle. I proposed a legal arrangement to protect your autonomy, Caleb corrected. There's a difference. Hannah let out a shaky laugh. That's the worst proposal I've ever heard. You've heard others? No, but still. Caleb almost smiled, then his expression grew serious. We don't have to go through with it. There might be other ways. No, Hannah said quickly. No, you're right. It's practical. And it works. She paused. But I need you to understand something. What? This doesn't mean you own me. It doesn't mean I owe you. It doesn't mean... I know, Caleb interrupted gently. It's a piece of paper, Hannah, that's all. It gives you legal protection. It doesn't change anything between us. She searched his face, looking for the lie, the trap, the hidden cost. She didn't find it. Okay, she said again, stronger this time. Let's do it. They rode into Blackridge the next week. The town clerk, a bored woman named Iris, filled out the forms without comment. Caleb signed, Hannah signed. 2 witnesses, a shopkeeper and a trapper passing through, added their names. 15 minutes later, they were married. Iris handed them the certificate. Congratulations, next. They walked out into the cold. Well, Hannah said, that was romantic. Caleb snorted. You want romance, you married the wrong man. I didn't marry you for romance. I married you to spite my uncle. Fair enough? They climbed onto their horses and rode back into the mountains. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, painting the snow gold and pink. Hannah dismounted, her legs stiff from the ride. She looked at the cabin, at the smoke curling from the chimney, at the mountains rising around them like walls. So, she said, what now? Caleb swung down from Rust and started unsaddling him. Now we keep doing what we've been doing. You work, I work, winter passes, spring comes. That's it? That's it. Hannah frowned. You really don't expect anything from me? Caleb paused, looking at her over Rust's back. I expect you to keep your word, to pull your weight, to not burn the cabin down. He paused. Other than that, no. She didn't know what to say to that. Caleb led Rust into the barn, and Hannah followed with Smoke. They worked in silence, brushing down the horses, checking their hooves, filling the water trough. When they finished, Caleb paused at the barn door. There's something I should tell you. Hannah's stomach tightened. What? The marriage is real in the eyes of the law. But as far as I'm concerned, you're free to leave whenever you want. You can take Smoke, take supplies, go wherever you need to go. I won't stop you. Hannah stared at him. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't want you to feel trapped, Caleb said. Not by Warren, not by the law, and not by me. Something broke open in Hannah's chest. Not painfully, more like ice cracking under the first warmth of spring. Thank you, she whispered. Caleb nodded and walked back to the cabin. Hannah stood in the barn, surrounded by the warm smell of hay and horses, and realized something. She didn't want to leave. The winter deepened. Snow buried the trails, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in minutes. Hannah and Caleb settled into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, tend the animals, chop wood, haul water, cook, eat, sleep, repeat. It was hard, relentless, but it was also steady, predictable. And for the first time in her life, Hannah felt like she was building something instead of just surviving. She got stronger. Her arms, once soft and weak, grew lean and corded with muscle. Her hands, scarred and calloused, could swing an axe for an hour without trembling. She could ride smoke through narrow trails without flinching, could set a snare in the dark, could gut a rabbit faster than Caleb. He noticed. You're getting good at this, he said one evening, watching her skin a hare with quick, efficient cuts. Hannah shrugged. I had a good teacher. I didn't teach you that. You figured it out. She looked up at him. What's the difference? The difference, Caleb said, is that I showed you how. You made it yours. Hannah didn't know what to say to that, so she went back to work. But his words stayed with her. One night, a storm rolled in. The wind screamed through the mountains, shaking the cabin walls, and the snow fell so thick Hannah couldn't see the barn from the porch. They spent the evening inside, the fire roaring, the world outside a wall of white. Caleb sat at the table, sharpening his knife. Hannah sat across from him, mending a tear in her coat. You ever think about what comes next? She asked. Caleb glanced up. Next how? After winter. After all this. Spring comes, Caleb said. We plant, fix what broke, keep going. That's it? What else is there? Hannah set down her needle. I don't know. I keep thinking about Warren, about all those laws, about how many people are still trapped. Caleb's hands stilled. Yeah. Doesn't it make you angry? Every day? Hannah leaned forward. Then why don't we do something about it? Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable. Like what? I don't know, she admitted, but there has to be something, some way to fight back. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said, Fighting systems is dangerous, Hannah. People who do that, they don't always win, and they don't always survive. So we just accept it? I didn't say that. He set down the knife. I'm saying you need to be sure, because once you start, you can't stop halfway. It'll consume you. Hannah met his eyes. I'm already consumed. Caleb studied her. Then slowly, he nodded. All right, he said. Then we'll figure it out, together. Hannah felt something settle in her chest. Not peace. She didn't think she'd ever have that. But purpose. The storm raged outside, but inside something new was beginning. Spring came slowly. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown earth and the first green shoots of new growth. The trails opened. The world expanded. Hannah rode out with Caleb to check the trap lines, and for the first time she saw the valley below, rolling hills, distant farms, threads of smoke from scattered homesteads. There are people down there, she said. Yeah. Do you ever talk to them? Sometimes. When I need supplies. Hannah watched the smoke rise. Do you think any of them are like me? Like, trapped? Caleb followed her gaze. Probably. Then maybe we start there. He looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. You serious? You said we'd figure it out together. Caleb was quiet. Then he smiled. Small, but real. Yeah, he said. I did. They started small. Caleb made a trip into the valley and came back with names. Women who'd been indentured, sold, bound by debts they'd never agreed to. Hannah listened, memorizing every detail. We can't save everyone, Caleb warned. No, Hannah agreed, but we can save someone. The first woman they helped was named Eliza. 19 years old, sold into service by her stepfather, working on a farm where the owner's son had wandering hands and no sense of boundaries. Caleb paid her debt. Hannah met her at the edge of the property and handed her a coat, supplies, and directions to the cabin. "You don't owe us anything," Hannah said, echoing the words Caleb had once said to her. "But if you need a place to figure things out, you're welcome." Eliza stared at her, tears streaming down her face. "Why?" "Because someone did it for me," Hannah said simply. Eliza stayed for 2 weeks. Then she left, heading west to a cousin who'd promised her work. Before she went, she hugged Hannah so tight it hurt. "Thank you," Eliza whispered. Hannah watched her ride away and felt something shift inside her. This was it. This was what came next. Not just survival, not just freedom, resistance. Word spread faster than Hannah expected. By summer, 3 more women had found their way to the cabin. Then 2 more. Then a girl who couldn't have been more than 15, eyes hollow and hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. Hannah didn't ask questions. Not at first. She just gave them food, a place to sleep, and space to breathe. Caleb built an addition to the cabin, a second room with bunks and a stove. It wasn't much, but it was warm and dry, and for women who'd been sleeping in barns or worse, it was a palace. Most stayed a few weeks, just long enough to regain their strength and figure out where to go next. A few stayed longer. One woman, a baker's daughter named Margaret, with burn scars covering her arms, stayed through the entire summer and taught Hannah how to make bread that didn't taste like sawdust. "You've got to let it rise slow," Margaret said, kneading dough with practiced hands. "Rushing it just makes it tough." Hannah watched, trying to memorize the rhythm. "How'd you learn all this?" "My mother, before she died." Margaret's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. "After that, my father sold me to pay for her burial. The man who bought me liked his bread fresh and his women quiet." Hannah's hands stilled. "What happened to him?" Margaret smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I waited until he passed out drunk one night. Then I left, took his coin purse on the way out." "Good. I thought so too." They worked in silence for a while, flour dusting the table like fresh snow. "You know what you're doing here is dangerous, right?" Margaret said eventually. Hannah nodded. "Yeah." "And you're doing it anyway." "Yeah." Margaret looked at her, something fierce and bright in her eyes. "Then I'm glad I found you." But not everyone who came was running from debts or bad contracts. Some were running from husbands. That's when things got complicated. The first time it happened, Hannah was alone. Caleb had ridden down to the valley for supplies, and she was chopping wood behind the cabin when she heard the horse. A woman stumbled into the clearing, barely holding onto the saddle. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, blood crusted on her lip. Hannah dropped the axe and ran. "Help me," the woman gasped. "Please, he's coming." Hannah caught her as she slid off the horse. "Who's coming?" "My husband. I ran, but he'll find me. He always finds me." Hannah's blood went cold. She helped the woman inside, sat her down by the fire, and grabbed a cloth and water. "What's your name?" Hannah asked, dabbing at the blood on the woman's face. "Sarah. Sarah Brennan." "How far behind is he?" "I don't know. An hour. Maybe less. I took his fastest horse, but he'll follow. Sarah's voice broke. "He'll kill me this time. I know he will." Hannah's mind raced. Caleb wouldn't be back until nightfall. She had maybe an hour to figure this out. "Can you ride?" Hannah asked. Sarah shook her head. "I can barely stand." Hannah swore under her breath. Okay, you stay here. I'll handle it." "You can't. He's dangerous. He's got a gun, and he's not afraid to use it." "Neither am I." Hannah grabbed the rifle from above the door, Caleb's rifle, the one he'd taught her to shoot over the winter. Her hands were steady as she checked the chamber. Sarah stared at her. "You're going to shoot him?" "Only if he makes me." Hannah stepped outside and waited. 20 minutes later, she heard the hoofbeats. A man rode into the clearing, big and red-faced, with a shotgun slung across his back. He pulled up short when he saw Hannah standing on the porch, rifle in hand. "Where is she?" he barked. "Gone," Hannah lied. The man's eyes narrowed. "Don't bullshit me, girl. I tracked her here. I know she's inside." "And I'm telling you she's not." He dismounted, hand moving toward the shotgun. "Get out of my way." Hannah raised the rifle. "Take one more step and I'll put a hole in you." The man froze. Then he laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You threatening me?" You know who I am? That's my wife in there, my property. You got no right. She's not property, Hannah said, her voice cold. And you're not coming inside. The law says otherwise. Then the law's wrong. The man's face darkened. You're making a big mistake. Wouldn't be my first. They stood there locked in a silent standoff. Hannah's heart pounded, but her hands didn't shake. She'd spent months learning to shoot, learning to stand her ground, learning to be something other than afraid. Finally, the man spat into the dirt. This isn't over. Yeah, it is. He climbed back onto his horse, gave her one last look of pure hatred, and rode off. Hannah stood there, rifle still raised, until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then her knees buckled, and she sat down hard on the porch steps. Sarah appeared in the doorway, pale and shaking. He's going to come back. I know. With others. The sheriff, maybe. The law is on his side. Hannah lowered the rifle, hands trembling now. I know that too. Then why did you do it? Hannah looked up at her. Because someone had to. When Caleb got back that night, Hannah told him everything. He listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he set down his pack and sat across from her. You know what you just did, right? He said quietly. I stopped a man from hurting his wife. You broke the law, interfered with a legal marriage, threatened a man with a weapon. Caleb ran a hand through his hair. Hannah, if he reports this, they'll come for you, maybe for both of us. So what was I supposed to do? Let him drag her back? Let him kill her? No. But you need to understand what this means. We're not just helping women escape debts anymore. We're going up against husbands, against the whole system of marriage law. That's a fight we might not win. Hannah met his eyes. I don't care. Caleb stared at her. Then slowly, he nodded. All right. Then we do it right. We get smarter, more careful. How? We stop reacting and start planning. We find people who can help, lawyers, sympathetic judges, anyone with power who might be willing to bend the rules. We document everything, build a network. Hannah's pulse quickened. You think that'll work? I think it's our only chance. Sarah stayed for 3 weeks. By the time she left, her bruises had faded, and there was steel in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She headed north to a sister who'd promised her work in a textile mill. Before she went, she clasped Hannah's hand. You saved my life. You saved your own life, Hannah said. You got on that horse. You rode here. That was you. Sarah smiled, fragile but real. Maybe, but you gave me somewhere to ride to. True to his word, Caleb started building a network. He rode down to the valley twice a month, meeting with people Hannah never saw. Merchants, clerks, a few sympathetic lawmen who turned a blind eye to certain transactions. He came back with names, contacts, safe houses, in towns Hannah had never heard of. There's a judge in Silverpine, Caleb said one night, spreading a rough map across the table. Older woman. Lost her daughter to a bad marriage. She's willing to push paperwork through if we can get women to her courthouse. Hannah studied the map. That's 3 days' ride. 4 in winter, but it's a legal route, clean. If we can get a woman there and file the right papers, she can get a separation without her husband's consent. What's the catch? She has to claim abuse, and she has to prove it. Hannah's stomach turned. How? Witnesses, scars, medical records if she's got them. Caleb's voice was grim. Most won't have any of that. It's her word against his, and the law usually sides with him. That's insane. That's reality. Hannah slammed her hand on the table. Then we change it. Caleb looked at her. How? I don't know yet, but there has to be a way. Over the next few months, they refined the system. Women would arrive at the cabin, battered and desperate. Hannah would feed them, listen to their stories, and assess their options. Some had family they could run to. Others had skills they could trade. A few had nothing but the clothes on their backs. For those with evidence, Caleb would arrange transport to Silverpine. For those without, Hannah would help them disappear. New names, new towns, new lives built on lies that were truer than the legal chains they'd left behind. It wasn't perfect. Some women went back, some were caught, and some were killed before they ever made it to the mountains. Hannah learned to live with that weight. But she also learned something else. She learned that resistance wasn't about winning every battle. It was about making sure the fight continued, about giving people hope, even when the odds were stacked against them. And slowly, word spread, not just among women, but among the men who profited from their silence. That's when Warren came back. Hannah was in the barn when she heard the horses. Not 1 or 2 this time, 6, maybe 7. Her stomach dropped. She stepped outside and saw them riding up the trail, Warren in the lead, flanked by the deputy and 4 men she didn't recognize. Hard men with hard faces and guns on their hips. Caleb was already on the porch, arms crossed. Warren dismounted, smug satisfaction written all over his face. "Mr. Ridge, niece." "Get off my land," Caleb said. "Can't do that. I've got a warrant." Warren pulled a folded paper from his coat. "For harboring fugitives, interfering with lawful marriages, conspiracy to commit fraud." Hannah's blood turned to ice. Caleb didn't move. "That warrant worth the paper it's printed on?" "Signed by Judge Carver himself." Warren grinned. "So yeah, I'd say it is." The deputy stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Ridge, we're here to search the premises. If you cooperate, this will go easier." "And if I don't?" One of the hard men rested his hand on his gun. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. Warren and his men pushed past, boots heavy on the cabin floor. Hannah heard them throwing things around inside, opening drawers, rifling through shelves, tearing apart everything she and Caleb had built. Margaret appeared in the barn doorway, face pale. 2 other women stood behind her. "Run," Hannah mouthed. Margaret hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the trees. Warren emerged from the cabin holding a ledger, Caleb's records of debts paid, and women helped. Well, what do we have here?" Caleb's expression didn't change. "Those are legal transactions." "Legal?" Warren laughed. "You've been paying off contracts that don't belong to you, hiding women from their lawful husbands. That's criminal conspiracy, Ridge. That's helping people. That's breaking the law." The deputy cleared his throat. "Mr. Ridge, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." "On what charge?" "Conspiracy, fraud, obstruction." Warren ticked them off on his fingers. "And if we find any of those women you've been hiding, we'll add harboring fugitives to the list." Hannah stepped forward. "This is my fault. He was just—" "Shut up," Warren snapped. "You're coming too." Caleb's hand shot out, gripping Warren's arm. "She's not going anywhere." Warren's eyes glittered. "You threatening an officer of the law?" "I'm protecting my wife." "Your fake wife, you mean?" Warren yanked his arm free. "You think I don't know what you did? Marrying her just to cut me out? That's fraud, too." "The marriage is legal. Built on lies, which makes it void." Hannah's heart pounded. "That's not true." "We'll let the judge decide." Warren nodded to the deputy. "Take them both." The deputy hesitated. "Sir, I'm not sure." "Do it." One of the hard men stepped forward, reaching for Hannah. Caleb moved between them, fast as a snake. "Touch her, and you'll pull back a stump." The man stopped, hand hovering near his gun. Warren's face darkened. "You really want to do this, Ridge? You really want to make this a fight?" "If I have to." The clearing went silent. Hannah could hear her own heartbeat, the wind in the trees, the creak of leather as the hard men shifted their weight. Then Caleb spoke, his voice low and steady. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back on your horses and leave. And if you come back, you'd better bring more men." Warren's smile was vicious. "Oh, I will. And next time I'll bring fire." He climbed onto his horse, the others following. But before he rode off, he looked at Hannah. "This is your last chance, girl. Come with me now and I'll forget all this. Stay with him and I'll burn everything you've built to the ground." Hannah stepped up beside Caleb, her voice clear. "Then bring matches." Warren's face twisted with rage. He spurred his horse and rode off, the others thundering after him. When the sound faded, Hannah turned to Caleb. "That was stupid." "Yeah. He's going to come back." "I know. With more men, maybe with the law behind him." "I know that too." Hannah's hands were shaking. "So what do we do?" Caleb looked at her, something fierce and unyielding in his eyes. "We fight." They spent the next week preparing. Caleb moved supplies into the hidden root cellar beneath the barn. Hannah rode out to warn the women scattered across the valley. Margaret came back with 2 others, refusing to leave. "If they're coming for you, they're coming for us too," Margaret said. "We might as well stand together." Hannah wanted to argue, but the words stuck in her throat. Because Margaret was right. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every woman who'd found refuge in the mountains, every woman who'd been given a chance to choose, and if they didn't stand now, the whole thing would collapse. 3 days later, a rider came up the trail. Not Warren. Someone else. A woman in a dark coat riding a gray mare. She dismounted and pulled off her hood, revealing silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. "I'm looking for Hannah Ridge," she said. Hannah stepped forward. "That's me." The woman studied her. "My name is Constance Merrill. I'm a lawyer from Silverpine. Judge Whitmore sent me." Hannah's breath caught. "The judge?" "She heard about your situation, about the warrant." Constance reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a stack of papers. "And she's not pleased." Caleb appeared on the porch. "What does that mean?" Constance looked at him. "It means Judge Carver overstepped his jurisdiction. The warrant he issued? Invalid. The charges? Manufactured." She held up the papers. "Judge Whitmore is filing a counter motion. If you're willing to testify about what you've been doing and why, she thinks she can get the whole thing thrown out." Hannah's heart pounded. "Testify? In front of who?" "A territorial magistrate. It's a higher court. If you can prove that the women you helped were in genuine danger, that the debts were predatory, that the system was being abused, then the charges against you won't stick. And if we can't prove it," Constance's expression was grim, "then you'll both go to prison. And every woman you helped will be dragged back to wherever she came from." Hannah felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. This was it. The fight Caleb had warned her about. The one that could consume them. She looked at Caleb. He met her eyes and she saw the same thing reflected there. Fear, resolve, and something else. Trust. "When?" Hannah asked. 2 weeks, in Silverpine." Constance tucked the papers back into her bag. "Judge Whitmore says you'll need witnesses, women willing to speak, evidence of abuse, coercion, anything that proves the system is broken." Hannah's mind raced. "I can get witnesses." "Good, because this is your one shot. If you lose, there's no appeal, no second chance." "We won't lose." Constance smiled faintly. "I hope you're right." The next 2 weeks were a blur. Hannah rode across the valley, tracking down every woman she'd helped. Some refused to testify, too afraid, too broken, but others agreed. Sarah Brennan, Eliza, Margaret. A dozen more, each with scars and stories that made Hannah's chest ache. Caleb gathered documents, receipts, contracts, records of debts paid. He found a doctor willing to testify about the injuries he'd treated, a merchant who'd witnessed abuse, even a few men who were willing to speak against the system that kept their neighbors enslaved. On the morning they left for Silverpine, Hannah stood on the porch and looked at the cabin, at the mountains rising behind it, at the life she'd built from nothing. "You ready?" Caleb asked. Hannah turned to him. "No." He smiled faintly. "Me neither." They rode out together, a small caravan of women and witnesses trailing behind them. The journey took 4 days, and every mile felt like walking toward a cliff edge. When they reached Silverpine, the courthouse loomed over the town square like a monument to every broken promise the law had ever made. Judge Whitmore met them in her chambers. She was older than Hannah expected, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "You're younger than I thought," the judge said, studying Hannah. "Sorry to disappoint." "I didn't say I was disappointed." Whitmore sat behind her desk. "I said you were young. Young people do stupid, reckless things. The question is whether those things are worth it." Hannah met her gaze. "They are." "We'll see." Whitmore turned to Caleb. "You understand what you're risking here?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you're willing to go through with it anyway?" "Yes, ma'am." Whitmore leaned back in her chair. "Then let's make sure we win." The hearing began the next morning. The courtroom was packed. Townspeople, merchants, curiosity seekers, and a contingent of angry men who glared at Hannah like she'd personally burned down their houses. Warren sat in the front row, smug and confident. The territorial magistrate, a stern man named Holloway, called the court to order. "This is a hearing to determine the validity of charges brought against Caleb and Hannah Ridge," Holloway said. "The prosecution will present their case first." Warren's lawyer, a slick man named Pemberton, stood and began to speak. He painted Hannah and Caleb as criminals, frauds, people who'd built an empire on lies and coercion. He called witnesses, men who claimed their wives had been stolen, debts manipulated, contracts voided without cause. It was a performance, and it was convincing. When Pemberton finished, he looked at Hannah with cold satisfaction. Then it was Constance's turn. She stood, straightened her coat, and called her first witness. Sarah Brennan. Sarah took the stand, her hands shaking. Constance asked her to describe her marriage. Sarah's voice was quiet at first, but it grew stronger as she spoke. She described the beatings, the threats, the night she'd fled with nothing but the clothes on her back. "And where did you go?" Constance asked. "To the mountains, to Hannah Ridge." "And what did she do?" "She saved my life." Pemberton objected, but Holloway overruled him. Constance called witness after witness. Eliza, Margaret, a young girl who'd been sold into service at 14. Each one told their story. Each one laid bare the system's cruelty. By the time Constance called Hannah to the stand, the courtroom was silent. Hannah sat in the witness chair, her heart hammering. Constance asked her to describe what she'd done, why she'd done it. Hannah told the truth. "I was sold on an auction platform because my father drank himself to death," she said. "I stood there, bound and humiliated, while people laughed. And the only reason I'm here today is because one man decided I was worth saving." She looked at Caleb. "Debt. So when women started showing up at my door, desperate and afraid, I did the same thing. I gave them a choice. And if that's a crime, then I'm guilty." The courtroom erupted. Holloway banged his gavel, calling for order. Pemberton stood, his face red. "This is irrelevant emotional manipulation. It's the truth," Constance snapped. "And the truth is that this system is broken. These women had no legal recourse, no protection, no voice. The Ridges gave them that." Holloway raised his hand for silence. Then he looked at Hannah. "Mrs. Ridge, do you believe you acted within the law?" Hannah hesitated. Then she said, "No, sir. I believe I acted above it." The courtroom went silent. Holloway stared at her. Then slowly he nodded. "I'll have my decision by tomorrow." That night Hannah couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of the boarding house, running through every word she'd said, every mistake she might have made. Caleb sat by the window, silent. "Do you think we did enough?" Hannah asked. "I don't know. If we lose, we won't. But if we do..." Caleb turned to look at her. "Then we tried. That's more than most people do." Hannah sat up. "That's not enough. It's all we've got." She wanted to argue, to rage, to demand guarantees the world couldn't give. Instead, she just nodded. The next day, they returned to the courthouse. The room was packed again, the air thick with tension. Holloway entered, his expression unreadable. He sat, shuffled his papers, and spoke. "I've reviewed the evidence, heard the testimony, and I've reached a decision." Hannah held her breath. "The charges of fraud and conspiracy are dismissed. The marriage between Caleb and Hannah Ridge is legally valid. And as of today, the system of debt-based indenture in this territory is under review for reform." The courtroom exploded. Some cheered. Others shouted in outrage. Warren shot to his feet, face purple with rage. But Hannah didn't hear any of it, because they'd won. Winning didn't feel the way Hannah thought it would. There was no rush of triumph, no sudden lightness, just exhaustion and the slow, creeping realization that the fight wasn't over. It had only changed shape. They left Silver Pine the next morning, the caravan of women trailing behind them quieter than before. Some peeled off at crossroads, heading to family or new towns or lives they'd only dreamed about. Others followed Hannah and Caleb all the way back to the mountains. By the time they reached the cabin, there were 8 women waiting on the porch. Hannah dismounted, her body aching from days in the saddle. She looked at the faces, some familiar, most not, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "How did you know?" she asked. A woman stepped forward, young and rail-thin with a baby on her hip. "Someone in the valley told me. Said if I needed help, I should come here." Another woman, older, with a scar running from her temple to her jaw, nodded. "I heard the same, that there's a place in the mountains where women can go, where someone will listen." Hannah looked at Caleb. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "We can't turn them away," Hannah said quietly. "I know." But we don't have room for everyone. Then we make room. Over the next month, they did exactly that. Caleb built another structure, a long bunkhouse with a central fireplace and rows of narrow beds. Hannah organized work rotations, teaching the women how to chop wood, tend animals, preserve food for winter. Margaret took charge of the kitchen, training others in baking and cooking. A woman named Ruth, who'd worked in a textile mill before her husband sold her contract, set up a small loom and started teaching weaving. It wasn't a home. Not exactly. It was more like a way station, a place between the life they'd escaped and the life they hadn't yet built. But for many, it was the first safe place they'd ever known. Hannah learned their stories slowly. She didn't push, didn't demand confessions or explanations. She just worked alongside them, and when they were ready, they talked. Clara had been married at 16 to a man 3 times her age. She'd borne him 4 children and buried 3. When the 4th died in her arms, something inside her broke. She'd walked out in the middle of the night and never looked back. Bess had been a school teacher, sold into service when her father's business collapsed. Her employer had touched her in ways that still made her flinch at sudden movements. Anna had no story at all. She'd arrived half frozen, barely conscious, and hadn't spoken a word in 2 weeks. Hannah let her sit by the fire and didn't ask questions. Each woman carried her own weight, her own scars, and Hannah held space for all of it, even when the weight threatened to crush her. One night, Caleb found her sitting outside in the dark, staring at the mountains. "You all right?" he asked. Hannah didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I keep thinking about the ones who didn't make it." Caleb sat down beside her. "You can't save everyone." "I know, but I keep seeing their faces, the ones who went back, the ones who got caught." She paused. "The ones who died." "That's not on you, isn't it? I'm the one telling them to run, telling them they can have something better. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm just giving them false hope?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You remember Sarah Brennan?" "Of course." "She sent a letter last week. She's working in a factory up north, saving money. She says she's never been happier." He looked at Hannah. "You gave her that. Not false hope. Real hope. A real chance." "And what about the ones who didn't make it? They made their own choices, just like Sarah did, just like you did." Caleb's voice was firm, but not unkind. "You can't carry everyone's decisions, Hannah. It'll break you." Hannah wanted to believe him, but the faces still haunted her. Winter came early that year, brutal and unrelenting. The cabin and bunkhouse were packed with women, 15 at the last count, and supplies ran thin. Caleb made trips down to the valley more frequently, trading furs and preserved meat for flour, salt, medicine. Hannah managed the household, mediating disputes, organizing work, keeping everyone fed and warm. It was exhausting. Some days she woke up and didn't know if she had the strength to keep going. But then she'd see Anna smile for the first time, or watch Clara teach another woman how to mend a torn coat, or hear Margaret's laugh echo across the clearing, and she'd remember why it mattered. Not all the women stayed. Some left as soon as the trails cleared in spring, eager to start fresh somewhere else. Others stayed through summer, learning skills they could trade. A few never left at all. Ruth was one of those. She'd been at the cabin for 6 months when she pulled Hannah aside one evening. "I want to help," Ruth said. "Not just here, out there, in the valley." Hannah frowned. "What do you mean?" "There are more women like us, trapped, scared. They don't know this place exists." Ruth's eyes were fierce. "I want to go back, spread the word, build a network so they can find us." Hannah's first instinct was to say no. It was too dangerous, too risky. But she saw the determination in Ruth's face and recognized it. It was the same fire that had driven Hannah to stand on that porch with a rifle, to testify in a courtroom, to keep fighting even when the odds were impossible. "You'll need contacts," Hannah said slowly. "People you can trust." "I know. I've already started making a list. And you'll need to be careful. If anyone connects you to us, I know the risks." Ruth's voice was steady. "But I also know what it's like to have nowhere to go. If I can be the person who tells them there's a way out, then that's what I'm going to do." Hannah studied her, then she nodded. "All right, but you don't do this alone. We'll set up checkpoints, safe houses. People who can get messages to us if something goes wrong." Ruth smiled. "Deal." She left 2 weeks later, heading back to the valley with a pack full of supplies and a map of safe routes. Hannah watched her go and felt the network expanding, stretching beyond the mountains into places she couldn't see or control. It scared her, but it also felt right. By the following summer, the network had grown. Ruth sent word of 3 new safe houses in towns Hannah had never visited. A sympathetic shopkeeper in Crestfall, a widow in Millstone who'd lost her daughter to a bad marriage, a blacksmith in Ashford who had a sister he wished he'd saved. Women started arriving from farther away, some traveling for weeks to reach the mountains. They came with stories of husbands who beat them, fathers who sold them, systems that crushed them. And Hannah took them in, every single one. But with growth came attention. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a burned-out safe house. The widow in Millstone sent word that men had come in the night, torched her barn, and warned her to stop harboring runaways. She was unhurt, but terrified. The second sign was a message from Ruth. Someone was asking questions. A man with money and influence offering rewards for information about the mountain refuge. The third sign was Warren. He showed up at the cabin one afternoon, alone this time, riding a black horse and wearing a coat that looked too expensive for the mountain trails. Hannah was splitting wood when she saw him. Her stomach clenched, but she didn't stop swinging the axe. Warren dismounted and walked toward her, hands raised in a mockery of peace. "Niece, don't call me that." "Fair enough." He stopped a few feet away, watching her work. "You've been busy." Hannah buried the axe in the stump and turned to face him. "What do you want?" "Just to talk." "We have nothing to talk about." Warren smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I think we do. See, I've been hearing things about women disappearing, husbands losing wives, debts going unpaid, and all the trails lead back here. Then maybe those husbands should have treated their wives better." "Maybe." Warren's smile widened. "Or maybe you've built yourself a nice little operation, charging desperate women for passage, for protection. I imagine there's good money in it." Hannah's hands clenched into fists. "I don't charge anyone anything." "No? Then how do you afford all this?" He gestured at the cabin, the bunkhouse, the cleared land. "Charity doesn't build empires, Hannah. This isn't an empire, it's a refuge. Call it whatever you want. The point is, you've made enemies, powerful ones, men who don't like losing their property." "Women aren't property." Warren laughed. "You keep saying that, but the law disagrees. And those men, they've got the law on their side. They've got money. They've got patience." He leaned closer. "How long do you think you can keep this up before they come for you?" Hannah met his gaze, her voice cold. "As long as it takes." Warren straightened, the smile fading. "You're making a mistake. These men won't stop. They'll burn you out, drag you into court again, and next time, you won't have Judge Whitmore to save you." "Then I'll save myself." Warren stared at her for a long moment, then he shook his head. "You really think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" "No, I think I'm someone who's tired of watching people suffer." "Well, get ready to suffer yourself." Warren climbed back onto his horse. "Because this is just the beginning." He rode off, leaving Hannah standing in the clearing, her heart pounding. Caleb emerged from the barn. What did he want? "To scare me." "Did it work?" Hannah looked at him. "Yeah, but I'm not stopping." Caleb nodded. "Then we prepare." They fortified the cabin, setting up warning systems on the trails, tripwires, bells, lookout posts. Caleb trained the women who were willing to shoot, teaching them to handle rifles and defend themselves. Hannah organized escape routes, hidden caches of supplies, contingency plans if they were ever forced to flee. It felt like preparing for war. And in a way it was. The attack came 3 weeks later. Hannah woke in the middle of the night to the sound of bells ringing. She bolted upright, heart hammering, and grabbed the rifle beside her bed. "Fire!" someone shouted outside. "The bunkhouse is on fire!" Hannah ran. The night was alive with chaos. Women streaming out of the bunkhouse, smoke billowing into the sky, flames licking up the walls. Caleb was already there, hauling buckets of water from the well, shouting orders. "Get everyone to the barn," Hannah yelled. "Now!" She helped pull women out of the bunkhouse, coughing and stumbling. The heat was unbearable, the smoke so thick she could barely see. Someone screamed. Hannah turned and saw Clara, trapped inside, trying to drag a trunk of belongings toward the door. "Leave it," Hannah shouted. My daughter's things are in here. Hannah swore and ran back inside. The smoke seared her lungs. She grabbed Clara's arm and yanked her toward the door, leaving the trunk behind. They stumbled out just as part of the roof collapsed, sending sparks spiraling into the night. Caleb appeared, his face streaked with soot. Everyone out? Hannah did a head count, 15 women, all accounted for. Who did this? Clara gasped, staring at the burning structure. Hannah didn't answer. She didn't have to. By dawn, the bunkhouse was nothing but charred beams and ash. The women huddled in the barn, wrapped in blankets, their faces pale with shock. Caleb stood with Hannah, surveying the damage. They're not playing anymore. No. What do we do? Hannah looked at the ruins, at the women who'd lost what little they had, and felt something harden inside her chest. We fight back. Caleb frowned. How? By making this public, by telling everyone what's happening here, by turning the people who want to destroy us into the villains they are. Hannah, it's the only way. She turned to him. We can't keep hiding. We can't keep running. If we want this to mean something, people need to know. Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he said, All right, but we do it smart. We get the story out through people who'll listen, journalists, reformers, anyone with a platform. Hannah nodded. Ruth knows people. She can help. Then we start there. Ruth arrived 2 days later, bringing with her a journalist from Silverpine, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Cross, who'd built a reputation on exposing corruption. Evelyn sat with Hannah for hours, taking notes, asking questions, listening to story after story from the women who'd found refuge in the mountains. This is bigger than I thought, Evelyn said finally. You're not just helping a few women, you're exposing a system. That's the point. And you understand what's going to happen when I publish this? The backlash? The danger? Hannah met her eyes. I understand. Evelyn nodded slowly. All right, I'll write it. But I need you to be prepared. Once this is out, there's no going back. Good. I don't want to go back. The article ran 3 weeks later, front page of the Silverpine Gazette. It was called The Mountain Refuge, How One Woman is Breaking the Chains of Indenture and Marriage Law. It was scathing, detailed, unflinching. It named names, described abuses, quoted women who'd been beaten, sold, discarded, and it held up Hannah and Caleb as examples of what resistance looked like. The response was immediate. Some people rallied. Letters poured in from across the territory offering support, donations, solidarity. A women's reform group in the capital sent funding. A lawyer offered pro bono services. A minister, one of the few Hannah could stomach, wrote a sermon condemning the mistreatment of women and calling for legal reform. But others reacted with fury. Angry editorials appeared in rival newspapers, calling Hannah a criminal, a homewrecker, a radical. Men gathered in town squares, demanding action. Sheriffs issued new warrants, and the network of safe houses started to collapse as sympathizers were threatened, intimidated, or worse. The widow in Millstone was arrested for harboring fugitives. The blacksmith in Ashford was run out of town, and Ruth sent word that she was going into hiding after someone tried to burn down the boarding house where she was staying. Hannah read the letters and felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. We did this, she said one night, staring at the pile of correspondence. We put them in danger. Caleb shook his head. They chose to help, just like you chose to start this. But people are getting hurt. People were already getting hurt. Now at least they're fighting back. Hannah wanted to believe him, but the guilt gnawed at her. Then, 2 weeks after the article ran, a letter arrived that changed everything. It was from Judge Whitmore. Hannah tore it open, her hand shaking. The letter was short, direct. Mrs. Ridge, your actions have sparked a movement. The territorial legislature is convening a special session to review marriage and indenture laws. They've requested your testimony. If you're willing to speak, this could be the beginning of real reform, but it will not be easy, and it will not be safe. The choice, as always, is yours. Constance Merrill will accompany you if you decide to come. Respectfully, Judge E. Whitmore. Hannah read it twice. Then she handed it to Caleb. He scanned it, his jaw tightening. This is what you wanted. Yeah. So why do you look terrified? Hannah sank into a chair. Because if I do this, I'm putting a target on my back, on all of our backs. And if it doesn't work, if they ignore me or twist my words or use this to crack down harder, then we've lost everything." Caleb crouched in front of her. "You've already put a target on your back. The question is whether you're going to use it to change things." Hannah looked at him, at the man who'd bought her freedom and asked for nothing in return, and felt something settle in her chest. "I'm going," Caleb nodded. "Then we're going together." They left for the capital a week later, accompanied by Constance and 3 women who'd agreed to testify. The journey took 5 days, and by the time they arrived, Hannah's nerves were frayed to breaking. The capital was massive, loud, chaotic. Buildings towered over narrow streets, and people moved in rivers, too busy to notice the small group of women who'd traveled from the mountains. The legislative hall was intimidating: marble floors, high ceilings, rows of seats occupied by men in expensive suits. Hannah walked in, her spine straight, and took her seat at the witness table. The session began. A legislator named Graves, thin and sharp-featured, opened with a speech about the sanctity of marriage and the dangers of radical ideas. Hannah's hands clenched under the table. Then it was her turn. She stood, walked to the podium, and looked out at the sea of faces. "My name is Hannah Ridge," she said, her voice steady, "and I was sold on an auction platform in Black Ridge because my father drank himself to death and left debts he couldn't pay." The room went silent. I stood there bound and humiliated while people laughed at me. And the only reason I'm standing here today is because one man decided I was worth more than the price on my head. She paused, letting the words sink in. Since then, I've helped dozens of women escape situations just like mine. Women who were beaten, sold, trapped by laws that treat them like property. And I'm here to tell you that those laws are wrong. They're cruel, and they need to change. Graves leaned forward. "Mrs. Ridge, are you saying you knowingly violated the law?" "I'm saying the law is broken. And when the law is broken, it's our duty to fix it." "But you can't simply ignore legal contracts." "I didn't ignore them. I ended them. I paid debts that shouldn't have existed in the first place. I gave women choices they were never supposed to have." Hannah's voice rose. "And if that makes me a criminal, then so be it. But at least I can sleep at night." The room erupted. Some legislators shouted. Others applauded. Graves banged his gavel, demanding order. Hannah stood there, heart pounding, and waited. Over the next 3 days, she and the other women testified. They told their stories, raw, unflinching, impossible to ignore. Clara described losing her children. Bess talked about the teacher who'd violated her trust. A woman named Joan spoke about watching her sister die in childbirth because her husband refused to pay for a doctor. The legislators listened, some with sympathy, others with barely concealed contempt. On the final day, Constance delivered a closing argument that left the room silent. "This isn't about radical ideas," she said. "It's about basic human dignity. These women are not asking for special treatment. They're asking to be treated like people. And if this body cannot grant them that, then it has failed in its most fundamental duty." The vote came 2 weeks later. Hannah was back at the cabin when the letter arrived. Her hands shook as she opened it. The territorial legislature had passed the Women's Protection Act. It outlawed debt-based indenture for personal debts. It granted women the right to seek legal separation in cases of proven abuse. It established oversight for marriage contracts and created penalties for coercion. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't everything, but it was a start. Hannah read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Caleb found her sitting on the porch, the letter clutched in her hands. "We did it," she whispered. He sat down beside her. "You did it." "No, we did." They sat in silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. For the first time in years, Hannah felt something close to peace. But she also knew the fight wasn't over. Laws could be passed, but enforcing them was another matter. There would still be women who needed help, still be men who refused to change, still be battles to fight. And Hannah was ready for all of it, because she wasn't the girl who'd stood on that auction platform anymore. She was the woman who'd torn the whole system down. The law changed things, but not the way Hannah expected. The Women's Protection Act didn't make the abuse stop overnight. It didn't magically transform cruel husbands into decent men or erase generations of thinking that treated women like livestock. What it did was create cracks in the foundation, small fissures where light could get through. and Hannah learned to work those cracks. The first test came 2 months after the law passed. A woman named Victoria showed up at the cabin, bruised and limping, with a story Hannah had heard too many times. Her husband had beaten her for burning dinner. When she'd tried to leave, he'd locked her in the cellar for 3 days. "I went to the sheriff," Victoria said, her voice hollow. "Showed him the bruises, told him everything. You know what he said?" Hannah could guess, but she let Victoria speak. "He said the new law requires proof, witnesses, medical documentation. He said my word wasn't enough." Victoria's hands shook. "Then he told my husband I'd come to see him. That night my husband broke 2 of my ribs." Hannah felt the familiar rage building in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "Did you see a doctor?" "Couldn't afford one." "Then we'll get you one. And we'll document everything, every bruise, every broken bone, every threat." Hannah leaned forward. "The law might be new, but we're going to make it work." It took 3 weeks. Hannah and Constance, who'd become a permanent fixture in their operation, built a case so airtight even the reluctant sheriff couldn't ignore it. They found witnesses who'd heard Victoria's screams, got a doctor to examine and document her injuries, gathered testimony from neighbors who'd seen the husband's violence. When they walked into the courthouse, Victoria's husband was waiting with his own lawyer, smug and confident. He walked out in handcuffs. Victoria stood on the courthouse steps, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't think anyone would believe me." "They didn't want to," Hannah said. "We made them." Word spread. Women started coming not just to escape, but to fight. They wanted documentation, legal representation, evidence that could stand up in court. The mountain refuge evolved from a hideout into something more structured, part safe house, part legal clinic, part training ground. Ruth returned from the valley with a new idea. "We need more than just one place. We need a network of lawyers, doctors, witnesses, people in every town who know how to use this law." Hannah looked at the map spread across the table, marked with safe houses and contacts. "That's a lot of coordination. That's what movements require." "I don't know anything about running a movement." Ruth smiled. "You've been running one for 2 years. You just didn't call it that." So they organized. Hannah traveled to towns across the territory, meeting with sympathetic lawyers and doctors, training women to document abuse, teaching them to navigate the legal system that had been designed to keep them powerless. It was exhausting work, frustrating and slow, with setbacks at every turn. But it was working. Not everywhere. Not for everyone. But enough. The backlash came in waves. Some towns refused to enforce the new law. Some judges found loopholes, and some men, furious at losing control, lashed out in ways that made Hannah's blood run cold. The worst was in a town called Redstone. Hannah received a letter from a contact there, a woman named Iris who ran a boarding house. 3 women had used the new law to leave their husbands. The men, enraged, had banded together and burned down Iris's building in the middle of the night. 2 women died in this fire. When Hannah read the letter, she couldn't breathe. She sat there, the paper trembling in her hands, and felt the weight of those deaths settle on her shoulders. Caleb found her outside, staring at nothing. "It's not your fault," he said. "I told them they could fight back. I told them the law would protect them." "The law didn't kill them. Those men did." "But Hannah's voice broke. "I gave them hope, and hope got them killed." Caleb sat down beside her. "No. Fear got them killed. Fear and rage and men who can't stand losing power." He paused. "You didn't cause that. You just refused to let it stay hidden." Hannah wanted to believe him, but the faces of those 2 women, women she'd never met but had died because of a movement she'd started, haunted her dreams for weeks. She almost quit. She came close one night, standing in the cabin, looking at the maps and letters and endless requests for help, and thinking, "I can't do this anymore. I can't carry this weight." Then a girl arrived. Couldn't have been more than 16 with a black eye and a baby in her arms. "Are you Hannah Ridge?" the girl asked. "Yeah, my mother told me about you. Before she died." The girl's voice shook. "She said if I ever needed help, I should come here. She said you were the only person who'd fight for someone like me." Hannah looked at the girl, at the baby sleeping against her shoulder, and felt something harden inside her chest. She couldn't quit. Because for every woman who died, there were 10 more who survived, and those 10 deserved someone who wouldn't give up. So she kept going. The movement grew beyond Hannah's control, which was both terrifying and necessary. Women in other territories heard about the Protection Act and started organizing their own efforts. Lawyers formed coalitions. Journalists wrote exposés. Even some politicians, usually women who'd clawed their way into male-dominated legislatures, began championing reform. Hannah became a symbol, which she hated. People wrote about her like she was some kind of saint, which made her want to scream. She wasn't a saint, she was just angry and stubborn and too tired to stop. "You need to lean into it," Evelyn Cross told her during one of her visits. "People need symbols. They need someone to point to and say, if she can do it, so can I. I don't want to be a symbol. I want to be a person." "Then be a person who happens to be a symbol." Evelyn shrugged. "You don't get to choose how people see you. You just get to choose what you do with it." So Hannah did. She gave speeches, even though she hated public speaking. She wrote articles, even though she'd never considered herself a writer. She testified in courthouses across the territory, telling her story over and over until the words felt hollowed out. But they still mattered. She knew because women kept showing up, kept fighting, kept choosing freedom even when it cost them everything. 3 years after the Protection Act passed, Hannah stood in the legislative hall again. This time, she wasn't testifying. She was watching as they debated a new law, one that would grant women the right to own property independently, to enter contracts without a husband's permission, to have legal autonomy. It was a harder fight than the first one. The opposition was fiercer, better organized. Men stood in the chamber and declared that such a law would destroy the fabric of society, tear families apart, lead to chaos. Hannah sat in the gallery and listened to them rant, her jaw tight. Then a legislator named Catherine Morse, a woman who'd been elected the previous year, stood to speak. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "I've listened to your concerns about the fabric of society. And I have a question. Whose society are you protecting? Because from where I stand, the current fabric is built on the backs of women who have no choice, no voice, and no power. If granting them autonomy destroys that society, then perhaps it deserves to be destroyed." The chamber erupted, but when the vote came, the law passed, barely, by 3 votes, but it passed. Hannah walked out of the legislative hall and found Caleb waiting on the steps. "Well?" he asked. "We won." He smiled. "Good." They stood there for a moment, watching people stream past, and Hannah felt something shift inside her. Not relief exactly, more like recognition. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over, but they'd moved the line, and that mattered. "What now?" Caleb asked. Hannah thought about the cabin, the women still living there, the network that stretched across territories. She thought about all the work still to be done. "Now we keep going," she said. Back at the mountain refuge, life continued. Women came and went. Some stayed for weeks, others for months. A few never left, building lives in the community that had grown around the original cabin. Margaret opened a bakery in the nearest town, supplying bread to the refuge and earning enough to live independently. Clara started a school, teaching children whose mothers had fled bad situations. Ruth became a full-time organizer, traveling constantly, building networks faster than Hannah could track. Anna, the woman who'd arrived half-frozen and silent, finally spoke. It took a year, but one morning she walked up to Hannah and said, "Thank you." Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of everything she'd survived. Hannah hugged her and didn't let go for a long time. The refuge itself evolved. What had started as a desperate escape route became a genuine community. Women built workshops, gardens, a small infirmary. They taught each other skills, shared stories, created something that didn't depend on Hannah's presence to survive. Which was good, because Hannah was learning to step back. It was Caleb who pointed it out first. "You don't have to carry everything yourself," he said one evening, watching her review correspondence late into the night. "Someone has to." "No, someone has to make sure the work gets done. That's not the same as doing it all yourself." Hannah looked up at him, tired and defensive. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you've built something bigger than you. And if you keep trying to control every piece of it, you'll break. Or worse, you'll become the thing you're fighting against." Hannah wanted to argue, but she knew he was right, so she started delegating. Ruth handled the network coordination. Constance managed legal cases. Margaret organized supplies and logistics. And slowly, carefully, Hannah learned to trust them. It wasn't easy. She still woke up at night, panicking about details she wasn't managing, but she also started sleeping better, eating regularly, remembering what it felt like to breathe without the weight of the world on her chest. One afternoon, she was working in the garden when a rider appeared on the trail. Hannah straightened, hand instinctively moving toward the rifle that leaned against the fence. But it wasn't an enemy. It was Warren. He looked older than she remembered, thinner. There was gray in his hair and lines around his mouth that hadn't been there before. He dismounted slowly, like his bones hurt. Hannah didn't move. "What do you want?" Warren stood there, hat in his hands. "I came to talk. We've got nothing to talk about." "Maybe, but I'm asking anyway." Hannah crossed her arms. "You've got 2 minutes." Warren looked at the ground, then at her. "I was wrong." Hannah's eyebrows rose. "What?" "About you, about this." He gestured at the refuge. "I spent years trying to tear you down. Tried to convince myself you were the problem." He paused. "But you weren't." "I was." Hannah didn't know what to say. She'd imagined this conversation 100 times, usually with her telling Warren exactly what she thought of him. But now that he was here, actually saying the words, she felt nothing. "What changed?" she asked. "My daughter." Warren's voice cracked. "She married a man I approved. Good family, good prospects. 6 months later, he put her in the hospital." He looked at Hannah with hollow eyes. "She came to me for help, and I told her to go back, to make it work, to be a better wife." Hannah's chest tightened. "She killed herself 3 weeks later." The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbearable. "I'm sorry," Hannah said finally, and meant it. Warren nodded. "I didn't come here for sympathy. I came to say you were right, about all of it, and I was too proud and too stupid to see it." He put his hat back on. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I wanted you to know." He climbed back onto his horse. "Warren," Hannah called. He looked back. "Your daughter deserved better, from her husband, and from you." Warren's face crumpled. He nodded once, unable to speak, and rode away. Hannah stood there for a long time, staring at the empty trail. She didn't feel victorious. She felt sad, because Warren's daughter was just one more name on a list that never stopped growing. But she also felt something else, a strange, bittersweet understanding that change didn't come from defeating enemies. It came from exhausting them, from making the old ways so painful that even the people who'd clung to them started letting go. Years passed. The refuge became permanent. The network expanded into neighboring territories. The laws kept evolving, slowly, frustratingly, but undeniably. Hannah turned 30, then 35. Her hands, once soft, were now permanently calloused. Her hair had threads of gray. She'd earned scars, both visible and not, but she'd also earned something else. A life. Not the one she'd imagined standing on that auction platform, but something better, something chosen. She and Caleb never had a traditional marriage. They didn't share a bed or speak words of love, but they built something deeper, a partnership rooted in respect, trust, and a shared commitment to something bigger than themselves. One winter evening, they sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching snow fall. "You ever regret it?" Caleb asked. "Marrying me?" Hannah thought about it. "No, you?" "No." They sat in comfortable silence. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't bought me that day?" Hannah asked. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Yeah, sometimes." And I think you would have found another way. Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe it would have been harder, but you would have gotten here." Hannah looked at him. "You really believe that?" "Yeah, because the thing that makes you dangerous isn't what I gave you. It's what you already had. You were just waiting for someone to show you it was there." Hannah felt something warm spread through her chest. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing me when no one else did." Caleb smiled faintly. "You're hard to miss." On Hannah's 40th birthday, the women of the refuge threw a celebration. There were 40 of them living there now, some permanent, others temporary. The cabin had expanded into a small village with workshops and gardens and a meeting hall. They made a cake, sang songs, told stories about the women they'd been and the women they'd become. Clara stood and raised a glass. To Hannah, who taught us that freedom isn't something you're given, it's something you take. Everyone cheered. Hannah stood, embarrassed but grateful. I didn't do this alone. Every woman here fought for her own freedom. I just made sure you had a place to catch your breath while you did it. Later, she walked through the village, looking at what they'd built. The workshops where women learned trades. The school where children played. The infirmary where a doctor, a woman who'd escaped her own bad marriage, tended to the sick. It wasn't perfect. There were still fights, still struggles, still women who came broken and left only slightly less so. But it was real. And it was theirs. Hannah stopped at the edge of the clearing where the original cabin still stood. She remembered the first time she'd seen it, cold, exhausted, certain her life was over. She'd been so wrong. One morning, a year later, Hannah woke to find Caleb sitting on the porch, staring at the mountains. You all right? She asked. Yeah, just thinking. About what? About how far we've come. He looked at her. You know there are refuges like this in 6 territories now? Women using what you started to build their own networks? Hannah sat beside him. It's not what I started. It's what we built together. Maybe, but you were the spark. Hannah thought about that. About the girl who'd stood on an auction platform, worthless and alone. About the woman she'd become, scarred, tired, still fighting. I wasn't a spark, she said. I was just someone who refused to stay invisible. Caleb smiled. That's the same thing. They sat in silence, watching the sun rise over the mountains. What do you think happens next? Hannah asked. More fights, more laws, more women finding their way here. That's not very optimistic. It's realistic, but it's also hopeful, because every fight means someone's still standing. Every law means the ground is shifting. Every woman who walks through that gate means the work mattered. Hannah nodded. Yeah, it does. She thought about all the women she'd helped, the ones who'd thrived and the ones who'd barely survived, the ones who'd stayed and the ones who'd left, the ones who'd won and the ones who'd lost. And she realized something. She hadn't saved them. They'd saved themselves. She'd just made sure they had the chance. That night, Hannah wrote a letter. Not to anyone specific, just words she needed to say. To every woman who thinks she's worthless, you're not. To every woman who thinks she's alone, you're not. To every woman who thinks she's trapped, there's a way out. It won't be easy. It won't be clean. But it's there, and you're stronger than you know. You just have to decide you're worth fighting for. Everything else follows. She folded the letter, sealed it, and left it on the table. The next morning, Ruth found it and asked, What's this for? For whoever needs it, Hannah said. Ruth smiled and tucked it into her bag. Years later, Hannah never knew how many, because she stopped counting. She stood on the same platform where she'd been sold. The town of Blackridge had changed. The auction house was gone, replaced by a community center. The laws had changed. The people had changed. But Hannah had returned for a reason. A group of women had gathered, survivors of the old system, and they'd asked her to speak. Not as a symbol, not as a hero, just as someone who'd lived through it. Hannah stood in front of them, older now, grayer, with hands that shook a little more than they used to. I was sold here, she said, on this exact spot, and I thought my life was over. She looked at the faces watching her, young and old, scared and strong. Women at the beginning of their journeys and women at the end. But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. And that's what I want you to remember. You're not defined by what was done to you. You're defined by what you do next. She paused. I'm not special. I'm not extraordinary. I was just a girl who got tired of being told she didn't matter, and I decided to prove everyone wrong. Her voice grew stronger. So if you're standing here thinking you're broken or worthless or too damaged to fight, stop. You're none of those things. You're a storm waiting to happen, and the world has no idea what's coming. The women stood and applauded. Some cried, some smiled, some just listened, holding on to her words like lifelines. Hannah stepped down from the platform and walked away, Caleb beside her. You think they believed you? He asked. I think some of them did, and that's enough. They rode back to the mountains together, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across the trail. Hannah looked back once, at the town fading into the distance, and thought about the girl she'd been. The one who'd stood on that platform with bound wrists and broken hope. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who'd learned that freedom wasn't something you waited for. It was something you built, brick by brick, scar by scar, until the walls around you crumbled and you could finally breathe. Hannah Mercer had been sold for nothing, and she'd become everything. Not because someone saved her, but because she'd saved herself. And in doing so, she'd shown countless others that they could do the same. The cabin lights glowed in the distance. Women moved between buildings, their voices carrying on the wind. Smoke rose from chimneys, horses grazed in the pasture. Hannah stopped at the edge of the clearing and took it all in. "Home," she said quietly. Caleb nodded. "Yeah, home." They walked forward together, into the light, into the life they'd built. And behind them, the mountains stood silent and strong, holding space for every woman who'd ever needed somewhere to run, somewhere to fight, somewhere to become who they were always meant to be. Because that's what Hannah had learned, in the end. You don't need permission to matter. You don't need validation to be worth fighting for. You just need to decide. And everything else follows.